First session of the day is titled Serving and features Regina Sexton on bridging oral and textual narratives, methodological approaches to conceptualizing the recipe in Irish folk tradition, and Lisa W. Smith, University of Essex, Regina Sexton, University College Cork, and Lisa Smith, University of Essex, 3,000 dishes on an Excel table or approaches to organizing information in recipes. The chair of this session is Professor Dan Bender from University of Toronto. Dan Bender is the Canada Research Chair in Food and Culture and Professor of Food Studies at the University of Toronto, the Culinary Research Center, and the Department of Physical and Environmental Sciences. He is the author of most recently of The Food Adventurers, How Around the World Travel Changed the Way We Eat, and co-editor with me of Food Mobilities Making World Cuisines. He is the current president of the Association for the Study of Food and Society, ASFS, and a member of the editorial collective of Gastronomica.
Thank you all so very much for coming out. Is it early? Might feel early to some, not you. So Regina Sexton is a leading Irish food and culinary historian, writer, broadcaster, and cook, based at the University College Cork. She is a graduate of, I should have practiced this word in advance, Ballymallow? How did I do?
Yep, that will do.
Right. Cookery School, and she serves as a manager. She serves as program manager of UCC's MA in Food Studies and Irish Foodways, and the postgraduate diploma in Irish food culture. And since 1993, she's been at the forefront of researching, teaching, and communicating Ireland's rich food heritage through academia, media, and public engagement. And her work includes the RTE television series, A Little History of Irish Food, and collaborations with national bodies such as the Irish Heritage Trust and Board Bia. She's an award-winning writer, a passionate educator, and she was named McKenna's Food Person of the Year in 2019, and currently serves on Ireland's Food Safety Consultative Council. Welcome, Regina.
Thank you, Daniel. Just opening thank you remarks to both Simone and Claudia, and also the other people behind the scenes. I do appreciate the work that goes into events like this. And this is an event that has been in the planning since April. So thank you very much. And also thank you for bringing together this community of practitioners, which, if you're like me, may be suspended in confusion at this point in time. I'm part of the Relish program, the working package, and when we were successful in that with the topic of recipes, it was quite exciting to consider the recipe in an Irish context. It was exciting from many perspectives, but also because of the enigma of the recipe in Ireland, which has lodged in my head since I started looking at Irish food history since the 1990s. The recipe in Ireland is enigmatic, problematic, a puzzle, and not just in Irish food studies, but also as it's located in both Irish history and Irish historiography. Recipes exist in English as an inheritance from Britain, or mediated with other influences through British contact. And for me, looking at these recipes falls under the title of the low-hanging fruit of research. And they can be treated from the usual kind of, I suppose, food studies topics or thematic approaches in terms of movements, migrations, culinary capital, I suppose, and also the usual things of colonialism and imperialism. But where is the vernacular tradition in all of this? When I was thinking about recipes in a vernacular context, I did a lot of reading, as you might imagine, still reading. But what I was struck by was one statement from Lisa Helka. And she makes this very short, pithy statement, which is dealing with recipes as provoking or a way of thinking about philosophical inquiry. And she makes the statement, recipes are tools we use to do things. And I loved that because it was simple, fundamental, but it was also a condensation of very complex thought. Where are these tools? What are the tools? What things can we do when we do them, when we redo them, and when we do them anew? So this simple distillation of thought was unsettling in its complexity. And I thought we could apply that to looking at Irish vernacular recipes, if you like, as tools. And we might, in that regard, think about what the diversity and the variance of a tool might be, thereby giving us the opportunity to unshackle ourselves from this Eurocentric thinking as to what a recipe is in its existence. And we might consider the recipe outside officialdom, outside institutionalism, and outside, as we've been hearing about through many of the papers, this Eurocentric way of thinking. So this presented alternative systems outside the established order of understanding. So then that brought me on to this idea of maybe reconceptualizing the recipe, which is what we wanted to do in this workshop to some extent. And this brings us to the kind of the really, I suppose, overused word or approach or concept of deconstructing, or taking something apart to rethink, to reconceptualize, to redesign, and to rebuild. And what I would like to do in that process would be to aim for more inclusiveness and cultural empathy when it comes to looking at the recipes as a system of dealing with the other. In an Irish context, the other for me here today and in this research is the vernacular. I better start moving along now because I have loads of slides. So anyway, these were all the questions that came to my mind when I got involved in the project. So all these conundrums. Why does Ireland not have a collection of recipes in Irish or in translation of vernacular dishes? Why does Ireland not have a collection of recipes in English from the vernacular? Where might these dishes be found? If they did exist, do they exist in print, oral traditions, and transcription? Recipes exist in manuscript and print form, but why did this production not extend to the vernacular? We do, in Ireland, have a very impressive corpus of medicinal texts from the later medieval period that were influenced by internal developments and external influences. Why didn't this happen in the culinary sphere, I suppose? And why is there no extant tradition in recipe production that reflects influence and interactions between orality, textuality, as evident in other cultural productions? So these were all the questions I couldn't answer, and I still can't. So I thought, yeah, okay, maybe we're looking in the wrong places, we're thinking the wrong way, and maybe we should broaden our thinking in line with how Lisa Helga speaks. And in that regard, I suppose, what I took as my site, just to give you, just to give you some idea, Ireland has, which kind of overlaps with what Daniel was talking about yesterday, Ireland has a very impressive manuscript tradition. So we have in Ireland the oldest collection, corpus of manuscripts in the vernacular in Europe. It's not that they are the only ones that existed, but they're the earliest extant ones. This one here is one of the early productions of, I suppose, what's called the Irish Iliad, one of the epic stories from the heroic saga of tales. We also have manuscript traditions of writing recipes by hand, okay, and this is Townley Hall in Ireland. I spent some time looking at their collection of handwritten recipes, and they kind of appear like this. These are various different sources, and these are handwritten recipes by elite women, and they're taking influence directly from Britain. So there's nothing of the vernacular or from the intrinsic emerging in these productions. This is just an example, for a typical example, which you find across the written and the printed texts, particularly till the 18th century, for a calf's foot pudding. We also have recipes, I suppose, that are going back in time, and this is the earliest collection that I'm aware of from Burghcastle in County Offaly, a recipe book written in 1666 by a woman called Dorothy Parsons. And there is me in the Muniments room in Burghcastle looking at this collection of recipes that was always in the popular mind taken to be the earliest collection from Ireland, it's not. It's written in England, and it has an incredibly complex story behind it. So, where do we go to have a look at the vernacular? And what I did in that regard was look at Ireland's national folklore collection. I'm not reading a paper, I'm speaking to the paper, so I'm just going to give you the kind of helicopter overview details here. The Irish folklore collection started in 1935. It was a government initiative, and it was something that happened in the early days of the new Free State. And the objective of the National Folklore Commission was to capture an Irish way of life that was under threat from being lost and forgotten. Two important characters in this initiative, Sean O'Sullivan here, and Seamus O'Dularga on the other side. This is a visiting folklorist from Scandinavia. And it's really interesting because what they did was, in particular Seamus O'Dularga, was that he sort of wrapped around the collection of folklore in a very set ideology. And this ideology was to capture an Ireland that was free from all sorts of influences, but also free from the inheritance of understandings that would have come from folklorists in the 19th century, antiquarians, and an inheritance of materials from that period. He also wanted to break free from the ideological ethos of the Gaelic and Celtic revival. So he was capturing a new Ireland for us, so that we might understand ourselves from a vernacular perspective. So the ideology is very strong. So what they did was they sent out collectors in various different ways to capture the folklore by interviewing adults in the main collection. So they employed full-time and part-time collectors, who were very skilled actually, who went out to interview people and record either in transcription or to record them orally. They also instigated this incredible project called the Schools Collection from 1937 to 1939. And in that regard, what happened was they come up with a booklet of questions called Irish Folklore and Tradition, printed in both Irish and English, and they distributed the booklet to all the primary schools in the 26 counties of the Republic. Those questions were a condensation of a larger collection of questions that were authored by Sean O'Sullivan from the last slide. The children in the schools, the children in the higher classes, about 10, 11 and 12, were given the booklet and they went home and they interviewed their parents, their grandparents, and sort of interesting members of the community. So they took notes in their jotters. And then they transcribed the notes into copybooks. The copybooks were brought into school. The teachers assessed them, and the most representative of the collection were transcribed into the official notebooks of the Commission, these large bounded manuscripts, and they were sent off eventually to Dublin. The main collection was interviewing adults, adult-to-adult interviews, and cumulatively, with this project, they gathered millions of pages of folklore, 80,000 photographs, over 1,000 videos, and a collection of oral recordings. And so much so that this is now the largest folklore collection in the world. In 2017, it was inscribed into UNESCO's Memory of Register, and here are two government ministers with the then director of the Folklore Commission, Christopher McCorrick. So it's an incredible collection. In 2012, they decided to digitize the materials in a project called Dúchas. And this is the website. You can go on and you can see it. The schools collection is fully digitized now. The main collection is in process. So you would imagine from that incredible artifact for the state that you'd have lots of information about food. And yes, you do. So food is there in all sorts of ways. But it's not there in the way that we understand a recipe. It's very much like what Michelle was talking about yesterday. These are instructions for ingredients to put them through a process to make them edible. So my thinking is, can we look at this information and think about it under the frame of a recipe? And I'll come on to that in a minute. But there is a collection of recordings that the archive itself has labelled as recipe. So it's an imposed title. So I looked at some of those recordings, and the one I've given you in the paper is the recording from, they're the two booklets, recipes. This is the collection in Dublin, in UCD at this point. And I want to go on to this. So there was this preset labelling of a recording as a recipe. So I was really interested in this. And this was a recording that was made by two really experienced collectors, Leo Corduff and Michael Murphy. Okay, these are very experienced collectors. This is Leo Corduff in America interviewing a woman in Massachusetts, right? Okay. So in 1965, these two collectors interviewed a lady called Rose Emerson. And the interview took place up here at the top of Ireland, Northern Ireland, in a little place called Cushendall in County Antrim, which is on the coast. And they interviewed Rose. So I listened to the interview. I've transcribed it for you as well. And it's brilliant. So they come along, and the objective of the collectors is to collect recipes for shellfish and dulsk, a type of seaweed. So anyway, the recording and the interview starts off, well, it's going well, and Rose starts talking about the dish. And in about 2 or 3 sentences after she starts, she veers off, way off, and she starts talking about children's health, now and then, now and in the past. So the interviewers are kind of attuned to this, so they gently coax her back. And they kind of go, yeah, we understand that, but can you now tell us, Rose, about the dish? So then she goes into this very prescribed, structured deliverance of the recipe. The sentences are short and clipped, the register is more official, and she tells us how the dish is made. And if you read through the lines, listening, she's a bit impatient that she's been put into this context of having to be official. And there's an assumption here that she's kind of saying, this is a waste of my time. You know how this is made. What am I telling you this for? You know it already. But that being done, she does that bit, and then she comes back into Rose again. And she veers off again in all different directions. And the interviewers leave her do that because they've got what they perceive to be the objective of the interview in capturing how a dish is made. So from there, she goes off and she talks about seasonality, religious practice, the famine, community collection of recipes, how the community came together during the famine and continues to do so, even though they're Presbyterian. Okay? And this is 1965, where sectarian tensions are rising, officially starting in 1968. So for me, I say, is this a recipe? And it's like what we heard yesterday from Sasha, what Rose has done. Here she is now. I love her. So this is Rose Emerson. And what she's done here is she's delivered for us Rose's world through talking about instructions as to how to make a dish. So not only is Rose using the recipe as an environmental or an ecological act, but she's also using it to describe her world as it applies to her and the universality of that. She doesn't claim the recipe for herself, she claims it as an expression of community. And what Rose has done here, for me, is complete the objective of the Commission to give Ireland an understanding of itself. Because Rose, through this structure of instruction has given us her world and her understanding of the world. And she completes, I suppose, the other thing as to what heritage might be in an Irish context. If you remember, I said the dúchais, the digitization process, is called dúchais, and dúchais is the Irish word for heritage. But like we heard with Gabriella in the first evening, these words can't be translated succinctly into the deliverance of pithy statements. So dúchais in Irish means loads of things. It means a connection to land, a connection to place, a connection to community, a connection with inheritance, ancestral wisdom, and all of these blended together to give you a sense, a feeling of belonging. And that is what Rose has performed in delivering an instruction of how to prepare food. She's one category. What I did then was I went back to the transcriptions. These are the transcribed versions of what people are telling what people are telling the interviewers as to how to prepare dishes. The corpus of material here is overwhelming. So what I did was I went through it and see, could I come up with a typology, a way of classifying what I'm seeing as oral narratives that have been transcribed. And I've done that, I suppose, in my own way. These are kind of descriptions of those narratives that we won't go on to. But I suppose what I've done is I've classified them in different ways. And the first one is where you come across these incidental details which infer an intuitive, tacit understanding of what a recipe is. This is a funny story about a sheep's head, and it's delivered through the eyes of a child, whereby the family have put down a sheep's head with dumplings to cook. They've gone off to mass, and one of the children is left at home to look after the pot. And the child looks in the pot, and he sees that the dumplings are moving around the sheep's head, and he's saying, "Oh my God, the sheep is eating the dumplings, we'll have nothing for the dinner." Okay? And then he runs off to mass to tell his mother that the sheep's head is eating the dumplings. Right? So that's a funny story. That's how it's classified. But within that, there is an idea of a dish and how it's cooked. All right? So that's that. And then we go through very sort of incidental details. This is an Irish one that I've translated in the paper, not here. And this gives incidental details as well. A bit more detail. This is bread that was made, the entry here is 1938. There's descriptions of how to make bread here. And it's becoming a bit more like the recipe as we understand it. And then this is a recipe here, as you might see, in the typical form. A recipe for Scotch box tea. And then my fifth category are the oral recordings like Rose Emerson. Okay. So, this is what we're dealing with. We're dealing with recipes coming from this kind of cooking situation over an open hearth and all sorts of stuff. So can these recipes, what's going on here with these recipes and these oral narratives? I spent a lot of time looking at them in the context of making oat cakes, right? So this is me making oat cakes. Okay, they're small here for the moment. But what I discovered is that the transcripts leave out crucial detail in the sequential stepping of how you make an oat cake, in terms of the texture of it, how you manipulate it, how you work with it, and specifically how you work with the oat cake over an open fire on this particular utensil called a hardening stand. Okay, so there was maybe 5 years when my whole life was obsessed with these hardening stands that are associated with northwestern areas and up in the north where Rose Emerson would live. So, of course, I started making the oat cakes on the utensil over the open fire. So there it is, my oat cake. That's it. But this is the reality. And this is my oat cake here. This is the Photoshop. And that's the reality. This is the official recipe. This is me in the vernacular. And what happened was, I wasn't used to my body in this context. These are small stands that are in front of the fire. I could make the oat cake. I could see the details that were missing in the oral transcripts. And trying to go from the making in the transcript to see what was missing in the gaps and so on. I did the experiments, as you can see. And of course, my body wasn't suited, a lot like what Fabio was talking about yesterday. So there was a whole other embodied approach to this, which is missing from the oral narratives. And what happened with me here was that I was used to walking around the kitchen, not like this, or not taking care of things at floor level. And of course, I was knocking down the stand all the time. So the stand was collapsing and my lovely oat cake was breaking up into these pieces, which actually, if you read Elizabeth David and her recording of an oat cake from County Donegal, she interviewed a woman there. These are called stars and moons. The moon being the big cake and the stars being all the little crumbs on the floor, which of course the hens invade the house and love and start eating. So anyway, there are all of these, I suppose, missing details. And then I thought, because this is a methodology workshop, that's another one, because I got obsessed. How might me come up with a methodology of looking at these transcripts and so on? And I imagined this great kind of cluster of things like the oral narratives, material culture, and maybe an informed observer or ethnography that could inform the missing aspects of the oral narratives. That's difficult to come by. But we do have this great collection published in 1937, which is seminal for me because it's a collection of recipes that gives them this label of Irish in a vernacular context, Florence Irwin. And this is her recipe for oat cakes and modern oat cakes. And she gives details here like, when you cook the oat cake over the open fire, don't worry about the curls that happen in the slice, which is exactly what happened with my oat cakes. You can see them curling here. So I knew that I wasn't doing things wrong. So I suppose for me, essentially what I'm trying to say here is, how do we approach all this? Because it's very complicated. So what I'm going to do is kind of design a system to analyze comparative forms. So how do we form a dialectic between the oral and the written forms, the oral and the transcribed, because you come into a pit of problems with each of these approaches, and how are the oral descriptions modified in print form? And don't forget that Ireland has this dual existence through time. The vernacular and the non-vernacular, the oral and the print. And a lot of research has been done on orality and literacy in an Irish context. So we need to apply some of the theoretical frameworks around that to recipe in a vernacular context. And then to see sort of the interrelationships and the dialectic, as I saw, between text and between forms. Identify shortcomings, gaps, hindrances, stylistic approaches to each source type. Address these last challenges with, obviously, consideration of kind of cross-disciplinary approaches, and establish more conceptual and theoretical frameworks that analyze alternative recipe systems. And I suppose determine from that the potential to apply to other data sets. I think this is an interesting one because that will bring us back to how we define the recipe. And for me, I suppose taking lead from Andrea Borghini, is to look at recipes as being from a constructivist perspective, but not just from a constructivist perspective, from a relative constructivist perspective, because the different forms of recipe in the Irish case, the Irish example, need to be looked at in a relative way as constructions of society. And that gives us insights into various different worlds, into various different Irelands, and to various different Irish worldviews when it comes to preparing food. Thank you.
Very pleased to welcome Lisa Smith, a senior lecturer in history at the University of Essex. She was a founding co-editor of the Recipes Project, collaborative blog, and a founding member of the Early Modern Recipes online collective. Excuse me. She has published widely on domestic medical caregiving, food, embodiment, and gender in early modern England and France. Her co-authored article on George III, Food and Masculinity, came out in the Historical Journal just last week. Wonderful, congratulations. And her co-authored monograph on the King's Dinner, Family, Nation, and Identity on the British Table, 1760 and 1820 to 1820 will be out in April 26th and shortly after that on my bookshelf. Welcome.
It's open access, so you don't even need to.
I won't buy it.
It'll be free,
That's it.
just to read it online. Right, so thank you very much to Simone and Claudia for organizing such a wonderful event. I'm really enjoying all of these thought-provoking discussions, and I feel like this is a much drier paper following on from yours. So I want to begin with a tale of two projects, and I came to the project we were just talking about, which is the one on British identity and food, when Adam Crimble came to me after a workshop where I'd been talking about another project on recipes. And he said that he'd found this royal ledger through the Georgian Papers project, and it listed all of the meals that had been eaten at Kew Palace. And he wondered, what could we do with a list of dishes served? I mean, that's a good question. Now, he'd approached me because of all of this other recipes work, and with the Early Modern Recipes Online Collective, we'd been asking a very different question, but this will be familiar to everybody in this room, especially after yesterday's last session, which is how can we effectively categorize recipes so that we can create linked data that allows us to track emerging things like knowledge, or track everything like knowledge circulation or individual ingredients or sensory experiences. So all of those things we've been wondering about. So why I want to look at these two projects together is to give you some insight into the decision-making process, because I know one of the things that came out yesterday was, well, do we have to do digital history? Should everybody be doing digital history? What is digital history? Is it, do you have to have funding to do it? So some things to think about. So the decision-making process when designing a digital project on recipes. Now, two things I want to discuss in particular are the usefulness of manual transcription. It's sort of like the slow food version of this. But also more about the opportunities and limitations within the categories you choose for a project. And we noticed that the last session yesterday, they had a lot of the same sorts of things that they were tracing. And you'll notice these are also things that we were trying to trace. So maybe there's some sort of consensus to be had there, but maybe not. So things to think about. So an introduction to MROC. So over the years, the steering committee has included Elaine Leong, Hilary Nunn, Jen Monroe, Maggie Simon, Michelle DeMio, Rebecca LaRoche, and Amy Tigner. And it was a coming together of historians and literary scholars. It was a feminist project right from the outset. We wanted to collaborate. We had this grand idea of finding all of the digitized recipe books for the early modern period and doing something fun with them, that we could pull them all together. And of course, one of our big goals was that we wanted to make women visible, and recipe books online were a great way of doing that. Our initial dream of building a database of recipe books, well, I'm just going to give you the spoiler now, this didn't actually happen, and there's good reasons for that. So the project took a very specific shape. We used it in our classrooms in particular. Teaching transcription is really, really useful. It's a way of thinking about texts, but also engaging with them on a very deep level. And we worked with partner institutions, specifically the Folger Shakespeare Library, the Wellcome Collections, and the Royal College of Physicians in London. Now, this project was shaped very much by the lack of funding. We had small teaching grants, so of course that furthered the pedagogical aspect of it. And we had the in-kind support from these institutions. I hasten to add, never our own institutions, but the archives. So I think that's important as well. And if we're thinking about this in terms of cultural heritage, we never actually thought about our project in those ways, even though there was a tremendous potential for thinking about it in heritage terms because of the wide public interest that we could generate with it. So the King's Dinner project was very different. It's a very small project in scope. We wanted to look at these ledgers and situate them within other household records and look at them to think about Britain as a whole. So the project was Rachel Rich, Adam Crimble, Sarah Fox, and of course me. And this was funded, not huge funding, but enough to pay for some research assistance and to build some basic tool. It was post-Brexit funding, in which the call came out that they wanted to explore Britain's role within the EU, and we thought, well, this is a great project for it. So initially we envisioned discussing primarily the German and French influences on the table in the royal household, because of course the monarch and his wife were of German background. So that was one of the priorities, but of course it was the British Empire that we couldn't get away from, and that actually dominated our book just as much as the French and German side of it. So then the question is here, because I think this project was very much about cultural heritage, although again, we wouldn't have phrased it as such, but it is very much about British identity, which is more fraught than ever, it seems, and has been since Brexit. The irony is, it's 3 Canadians on the project and only 1 English person. I don't know about holding up a mirror to yourself here. So with this list of foods, it's probably useful just to give a bit of context about why this even existed. The ledger was required to account for royal spending. That was basically it. It's a very boring account book if you look at it that way. And the reason it came into being was George III, shortly after he came to the throne, made an agreement with Parliament that he could turn over his lands to them to manage, but in return he'd get a very substantial annual allowance for him and the royal family. Quite substantial. There's an interesting point of comparison too in the project with his table, which does show a lot of traces of German influence, and his son's table at Carlton House, which really had no German influence, but was very, very high fashion. So there's lots of interesting things you can do with that. So we were looking too at changes over time and how the household was fed. It wasn't just about the king's table. It was actually about how the food gets to the table, all of these things about seasonality, all of these big questions that we've been talking about. So I want to talk first about transcribing. And yesterday, I know after the panel, Helmut was saying that once you have a usable digital file, you can start to do any number of things to it, but the first thing is to make it usable. So by actually doing transcriptions, that's one of the first steps. If you have just a PDF of something, it's no use. You can't do anything with it. So you got to transcribe it. So you can be doing digital history just by doing transcription. It's the start of something. It's not the end, but it's a start. Now, you might wonder, why do it yourself? HTR, or handwritten textual recognition, is actually getting pretty good, especially with Transcribus, for the English language. Maybe not so for other languages yet. So why bother doing it manually? Well, again, it goes back to that idea of slowness, really deeply engaging with the sources. But I also think it's an integral part of the research process because you are forced to think about what's going on. And, with recipes, they're small, but there's a lot of information encoded within them. With the ledgers, you'll find that there's also a lot of information encoded, even in just a dish name. So what can you learn? I think quite a bit. So I'll give you some examples of transcribing processes. So this one is the Dromio transcription platform, which is through the Folger Shakespeare Library. Now, institutions like the Folger were very, very interested in partnering with us to get their materials transcribed. And this is for a couple of reasons. First of all, although they want to make their things usable for a wide range of people, it takes a lot of time to run transcription projects. It's a lot of effort, and you also need to have people who have the specialist skills, both in contextualizing and teaching the transcription. They don't necessarily have all of that time. So, as researchers, we can bring that to them. But it makes it visible for people. It brings in new users. So they have priorities here. We also use this system within our own classrooms. And again, we had lots of observations about the deep engagement with the source material, critical thinking, and creativity. It's slow, though. In terms of the project, I can't point confidently to everything because we have about 40 manuscripts in various states. Some still need reconciling, some haven't been entirely completed, and some are all completed in the Folger catalog. So it's very, very slow. But again, this reliance on getting the public to transcribe is also something that shaped what you can do with the project. Now, as for the ledger, we had very different reasons for transcribing this. The ledger is actually a form of structured data. You could theoretically, pop it into HTR. As you can see, the hand isn't too bad. It's quite regular. There were lots of reasons why you could use handwritten textual and textual recognition for it. But it's complicated because the closer you look at a lot of these details, you find all sorts of things, and this maybe isn't the best example of a page for it, but you would often find French and English mixed together, which isn't surprising given the food. You'll find German sometimes thrown in, so you've got multiple languages. You also, some of my favorite examples were where you'd have the French spoken phonetically and then transposed into English. So it turns into a great big mess. And you need to have that familiarity with the languages and the dishes to be able to figure it all out. It just wouldn't be picked up in an easy way by handwritten textual analysis. The vocabulary could also be ambiguous. Through the project, for example, we've occasionally found new words that we're talking with the OED about putting into the dictionary as the first instances of use in the country. So that's why we did it this way. But it also meant that by really looking at line by line, you're forced to start thinking about, well, what is it can we do with this? What is it that we actually want to recognize here? So this takes me to the next point, which is about categories. It's not the most exciting of topics, but I think it's really fundamental to digital projects, and it's something that really underlay the last session yesterday. This is the underlying structure for any project. So if indeed you've got a data set, one of the things you'll spend a lot of time doing is writing up the documentation. So you can't just, bung something up there and not explain the categories to people. So for the King's Dinner, our documentation for just basically a ledger runs to 73 pages, and it talks about all of the 33 categories that we identified and why we chose to go with that route. So it's quite intensive, how you choose those categories. So with textual I want to turn now to textual communities, which I haven't mentioned yet. But when MROC started, our first foray into online transcribing was through a platform called Textual Communities, which was at the University of Saskatchewan, where I was at that point in time. And it was initially designed for poetry, and we wondered, could you take this one that was designed for poetry, which in some ways, on a page layout, it's a nugget, it's densely packed, might have similarities with recipes. I'm not sure it did, but it didn't really work. But one of the things we could do was tag everything with the TAI XML, as we learned about yesterday. But it's a language that's very hierarchical, and it doesn't always allow you to capture all of the details that you might want, such as are things torn or stained. So you're capturing, the things that we heard about yesterday, and the way in which the page looks. It did have some encoding that might allow us to capture some details, like specific remedies, which is what we chose to focus on as a medical project at the time. So to do that, we looked at using a folksonomy. So we were trying to standardize some of the language. The folksonomy came from another digital project that I was working on medicine. And we were trying to think about how would we actually describe things to make it findable. So even then, we were thinking about categories. Now, just want to go back to this. Does anybody feel like you could transcribe and add in all of that XML coding yourself? Yeah, it's pretty intimidating, right? So you needed to have quite a bit of specialism and confidence. So you could do it in a classroom just about, but it's very time-consuming. One of the things we quickly shifted to was working with Dromio through the folder instead, which was much more user-friendly. It has hot buttons, so you could expand words quite easily because we're doing it into semi-diplomatic. You even, the basic things you encountered regularly, and you could just highlight it. It would do the XML for you. You didn't have to worry about it. So it was much more user-friendly, and in fact, we did find that moving to this allowed the general public to come and work with us in ways that they wouldn't have been had we stuck with textual communities. But when we moved to this system, again, we had to think about, well, what is it do we want to actually try to track here, and how granular do you want to be? Because, with the projects we heard about yesterday, they are very, very granular. And that just wasn't something we could do with working with the crowd or even in the classroom. So we decided to focus on 3 particular things. You can see the categories up there: name, place, and amount. And the reasons we chose those, and this took days of deliberation about what did we actually want to focus on this time, is because although we were all interested in the medical side of it, we knew that most people would be interested in transcribing with us because they're interested in food history. So what would make things more user-friendly across the board? So as you can see, though, it's still not the most user-friendly background for transcribing. There's still quite a bit going on. But we did get quite a bit done. Now, the reason I've got this up here is in my initial paper, I had a few pops about AI, and I wanted to show you some of the images from the folder of things we had actually gotten into the catalog there. But I couldn't actually access the folder website because it kept telling me I was an AI bot. Anyways, so at the moment we're using from the page, which we're using with the Welcome and the Royal College of Physicians. And this one has only the most basic TEI XML. It really only does the page structure. It's the most basic you can have. And part of it is because it's an out-of-the-box system, so we didn't have a chance to develop any customized tags. But I'm going to say I don't think it really mattered in the end. And this is despite the fact I love all of these categories so much. Now, one of the reasons is that because these ones that we've done through the folder are stored on their catalog, and we had it, we worked with them to put it into both, you could do both modern and historical searches. And that's how most users actually want to encounter this. What is innovative is that you can then download what are essentially bags of words, as you might call them. So you could get one volume or multiple volumes, and then do your own searches by running them through things like Python. But this puts it on the researchers. What is it you want to do? Because I think quite often we can overcomplicate things. So I don't know that you necessarily need to have all of those categories, except if you're the researcher and you've designed your specialty. So this is a snippet from the Excel spreadsheet that we have for our 3,000 dishes on a table for the King's dinners. Now, because research was the point here, we had to think about what did we want to do to make it searchable. So we retrofitted the recipes to the individual dishes and then broke it down into the component parts. And of course, this actually followed a very similar process to the ones we heard about yesterday in terms of what are you thinking about with the ingredients. Of course, when you've got just the recipe dish name, you can't break it down into the full recipe. You don't know exactly what was in it. You can look at other recipe books to figure out some of the things, but in the end, you've really got the dominant ingredient. And I think that's fine. We then broke it down into other ways of looking at it. So, meats, cereals, seafood, how it was served, the various types. You could break it down into who was eating the foods, the dish types, the way in things they were prepared. There's some sensory elements. Are they served hot or cold? You can look at flavor profiles, that certain things start appearing on people's tables quite regularly and not other tables. Are there sauces being served with it? Are they the umami ones of Britain? Are they they're unctual, the very sort of buttery, tarragon-y ones that you would get in France? So there's lots of different ways you can trace this. So what I would suggest is that you can tell lots of different stories. So you can tell a story about just the piggy dishes that they ate and who was eating these different ones. You could do that. And actually you can make all sorts of tales there. You could tell a story about what they're eating when, because of course you've got the dates on it. So the seasonality, what's happening with those. You could tell a story about the different tables. And, notice that the footmen, for example, have basically a meat diet, or you've got the king and queen who get a bit of everything, but actually quite like fowl, mostly. Or we've got the keeper of the robes, who's Mrs. Schwellingbird, who is from Germany, and she really liked vegetables more than anybody else. So there's various ways you can work with that data to tell these different stories. So to conclude, what I want to reassure you is that if you try digital history, you've got a range of things, all the way from the one-man show that Daniel's running that goes into a lot of deep and interesting things. You can try various other things, such as partnering with archives and doing basic transcriptions, which then gets the data ready for other people to use, all the way to applying for big funding and producing a beautiful tool. And there's a lot of ways in between that people can be doing things. The only thing I would insist on is really thinking deeply about those categories. And I think when you look at the projects yesterday and trying to think today, on the one hand, we're starting to get quite a sense of things we do want to trace, but then there's the data that Regina was talking about, which is a bit messier, and trying to figure out how to include that. So, thank you.
Thank you to you both for some fabulous papers, so fascinating. I'm really just grateful to learn about these new, sources and methods that I hadn't known about before. I guess I'm really struck by, with Regina, how you searched for all these things, right? They're in all these different places. They don't use a consistent, necessarily, vocabulary. So are you, I'm just curious that it's such a fabulous and rich body of work, but how do you even look for, what do you look for? Are you looking for keywords? Are you just trying everything? So, and it also, I feel like, ties with Lisa's in the idea of categories and, how the person who's actually creating the database is structuring the way that we can look or think about things. So, I'm just really curious about that part, about how you're even going about doing the search in order to find food-related, stories and everything else.
Sure. Is that okay?
Yeah, it should be on right now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. Thanks, Michelle. Yeah. Okay. So I suppose I worked with those databases quite a lot on the subject of oatcakes, and I suppose that was kind of my introduction to it. That was the pilot study. What I should say is that kind of what Lisa was saying in terms of the public involvement is that all of the transcripts exist in image form on the site. Actually, the site is open access, open to everyone. So I'd encourage you to have a look at it. It's quite extraordinary. It really is extraordinary. It's a national treasure, separating all the ideological backgrounds to it and so on, which we have to take into account. So you go onto the site, and I suppose you can search by particular words or whatever. And I was interested, have you got a kind of a design plan in place, first of all, to do the searching? I should, I suppose, embed everything I'm saying in the fact that what I told you today is really the story of it. And it's more kind of leaning towards the qualitative side of things. The quantitative study has to be designed properly yet. And that's a back and forth process. So you do the searching, how successful is it? redesign, start again, all over, etc., etc. So my first experience was with what they did as well, I should have said, is that they got members of the public involved to transcribe the texts, both in Irish and English. So you go onto the site and you have the original in image form and you have the transcription. So you can do searches, various different searches in that regard. So I did that with the oatcakes to see what was the information coming back. And of course it's overwhelming. So then it's a matter of staying close to the text, seeing the sort of the convention of return, if you like, because there is a convention of return in terms of how the information is delivered. That seems to be consistent across the categories. So that's fine, and that's the easy bit. It's trying to analyse and identify what's missing in the information, I suppose. And that demands a sort of a commitment to go elsewhere and to see how you can come up with a complementary conversation between different research forms. So that's what I did with the oatcakes, and that's where I saw that a lot of these transcriptions were defective. An awful lot of the information was missing. And it was almost like the children and the contributors were delivering faulty memory. And it was also like that they were trying to satisfy the prescriptions of the questions that were set in an ideological context by the Folklore Commission. So how you read it is multifaceted. And how do you deal with that then in trying to squash it into these perceptions of recipes? So that's, I suppose, the messiness behind it all at present. But I think there is stuff there that's going to come out that will give a collective narrative for Ireland.
Lisa, did you want to on that, or
You want to
open up to discussion?
Just open it up to discussion.
Ariana?
Thank you so much for starting us off with a very exciting panel for the day. I'm curious to hear about the role of the audience in the recipes that you study. So you had a great story about Rose speaking directly to the audience, and recipes are dialogic, but in the oral context, we get to, there's a person listening right there. And when the recipe is written, the audience is a little more distant. I'm also curious about, in your work, Lisa, the ratified and perhaps unratified audiences like us for the ledger books, but also the recipes you work with.
Does this work? Yeah. I think it's really interesting when you look at the audience doing the transcribing. And I was thinking as you were talking about how things can be so easily left out of transcriptions. And it's true that when people come in and you don't know what their background necessarily is, even with students where you have some idea, there's a lot that can get left out, which is why it's really important to have experts then doing the follow-on. But what they do is engage deeply with these materials, and they're in a process of conversation with them as they're working through them. So there's always these questions about, well, what is this ingredient? I don't really understand how you'd even prepare this. And so there's this constant conversation with the people doing the transcribing, the material, and then us there trying to moderate this. So it is very much in conversation. In terms of, because I think I might have misunderstood your question, but in terms of playing with the data sets, I really do think that the transcriptions are the ones that will appeal to a wide range of audiences, because you can either do lots of research with them as you want to do them, or people are just interested in the recipe, so they'll come in and they've got a nice, easy, readable format. The King's Dinners ones, we were actually slated by an internal ref review, which is the research assessment one, where they said, well, why haven't you built a big, beautiful website so it would lure people in and, they would come and use us? I was thinking, well, the transcriptions might be interesting, and that's one thing, and you can pop those up easily enough. But when you have an institution that is not a willing audience for this, none of our universities would put them up because there's lots of, there's long-term costs involved with storing data. So you've got that audience that doesn't want anything to do with it, even though they want to claim the research. But then realistically, menus aren't the sexiest thing to sell to people, apart from the New York Menus Project that did seem to be, so maybe there's lessons there about what they could learn. Yeah, I don't know. I think that one is more of a researcher-friendly one. And I don't think there's any problem with that either, that different research talks to different audiences, and it doesn't always have to be everybody.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And that's why Rosie, as she's known actually, that's why Rosie, that interview was particularly valuable, because you saw transcription in action, if you like. And those two interviewers are crucial to this process, because those two interviewers were doing a double role. They were doing the informed interviewer, but they were also doing the uninformed interviewer. So they knew what she was saying, because actually I think Leo Codorf is from Northern Ireland. So he could pick up on all of the cues. He could pick up on the cues of cadence, of strange words that she was assuming that they understood, like she's talking about a gabble of dulsk, a gabble of seaweed. And of course, Leo knows what this means, but he knows that the receiver, the uninformed receiver, won't understand this. So he's playing two roles here. He's doing the culturally empathetic interviewer, and he's also doing the uninformed receiver. So they play a crucial role, and they get it. They can pick up on the cultural cues. So that's why those recordings are extremely important. They really are gems. When you don't have that set up, when you have particularly in the schools collection, the mains collection, where the people have been interviewed and those oral transmission has been transcribed, you're missing something there now. What do you do then? How can you compensate for this? And this was my idea, that you get complementary sources, triangulation if you like, complementary sources to feed into holistic. So you have the transcription, and you're geared up to identify what's missing. And then you see, well, are there other sources now that could inform that, to give us a more insightful understanding of this? So you can go to ethnography, you can go to informed official people that record recipes. So do we have an informed community that can read these recipes meaningfully? And that's why Florence Irwin comes in. Because Florence Irwin is not just a recipe writer. She's really interesting. She's based up in Northern Ireland as well. But she played the role, she worked with the government in the Department of Agriculture and Technical Instruction in the early 20th century. And she was a woman that was sent around the landscape to teach Irish women how to cook. Well, because they couldn't cook. That was the official interpretation. So she had cultural insight too. But she's putting her recipes in print form. So if you align now Florence Irwin, modern oatcakes and oatcakes, the transcriptions which were faulty anyway, we know that, in the absence of the oral recording, you get a more insightful understanding. But it's not the full one. And that's where I suppose the experimental work came in, working with those toasting oat hardening stands, the ones that I worked with, because they're a different world altogether. And what's completely missing in the oral transcriptions about oatcakes is that they've forgotten how to make the oatcakes. That information hasn't been passed on for various different reasons, because they're not making oatcakes anymore. They're buying factory-made bread. The palate has changed, and all sorts of stuff, etc., etc. But also because they're using ovens rather than the hardening stand over an open fire. So these are different worlds all satelliting around one kind of topic. And the richness, I suppose, is going into all of these different places to see if you can put a usable, practical understanding on the recipe, and then you can go off in your interpretative, theoretical thinking, conceptual thinking after that. So I suppose in many ways that cluster of complementary sources is what I say in the paper is the interviewer by proxy.
jump in. Thank you for these very rich presentations and very generative as well. Piggybacking on Ariana's question, is this what it meant to you to build public-facing interfaces based on your work? So that is, there is an implicit kind of civic mission of having that data and presenting it to the public. And as researchers, it's very difficult to kind of move away from the text, from all the time you spend on research. How do you, what mental space it took, what questions and what processes and maybe expertise you gained through thinking about the afterlives of these projects and on making them more accessible?
Gosh.
I mean, you mentioned the afterlives of the project, and it's so bound up with sustainability. And I was thinking of Helmut yesterday and how he's, that's for the next 50 years at least, because he knows that is not likely to get funded again. And so you really do have to have some sort of sustainability. And in many ways, because these projects had very small funding or no funding, I think the sustainability has been to make them, to either embed them with the archives, who are prepared to take on that hosting, or to do the most minimal things. So with the Excel spreadsheet, and I think everybody here can manage Excel spreadsheets. It's not high tech, but it's transferable information that's now available on Zenodo, which is going to stay there. So I think it's really useful to keep in mind that there's options, that it doesn't all have to be, preserved in big ways. And I mean, even with the website question, because you could make things even more visible and really, it could be really exciting. But these things cost money. They take time. They require maintenance. You need to have a place to host them. If you don't have an institution that's prepared to take on that hosting, it falls to the individual researcher. So there's a lot of questions that go into whether you go with a bells and whistles approach or a very pared down approach. In terms of how to get people to engage, I mean, one of the ways in which we've been quite successful with MROC is by social media. And there's a lot of foodie people out there on social media. So I think that's been one of the ways it's been quite useful. And we talk about these things and, really engage with people, particularly during the transcribe-a-thons. So, I mean, there's a big public-facing element. It's really exciting. It's very energetic. It's one of the high points of my year. So I love it. Now, with the British identity one, right now we could be out there saying a lot. We could be talking to the media. We could be making very pointed comments about Britishness, but all of us have remained silent. Sarah, the only English person, is a bit resistant because she's quite new in her permanent job. The rest of us are Canadians. And it feels like a very political thing to say, especially when at the moment you're walking down the streets and you're seeing St. George's flags all over the place. And you're thinking, you know what, I could say a lot about British heritage right now, but I'm not touching this. I'm just not touching it. And so there's a weird tension between that politics of what to say and when to say it. And at the moment, it just feels a bit too heated to say anything at all to deal with that cultural heritage angle, even though it might be constructive, but it feels risky.
Well, we are part of the empire.
You say that, but...
No, really.
No, I mean, and you're right. There's layers of what people can and can't say. I think we have to be upfront about that. That a Canadian saying it is going to have a better chance of being heard than an Indian scholar.
Yeah.
And there's layers, so many layers of that. But even us Canadians at the moment feel a bit unsettled as they're talking about taking away indefinite leave to remain. So it's fraught.
Yeah.
It's very fraught. Just from the Irish material, I suppose, I'm in and out to this project. The project, I should have said it properly, the project is housed in University College Dublin. So they have stewardship of the material, but it's open access. Anyone can access it. It's fantastic. And it's government funded. And it's viewed as being the property of the state. And I suppose there was a lot of media attention around it, particularly with the UNESCO success in 2012. And that drew people to the site. And it also drew people to the site on a very emotional level, because particularly with the schools collection, you couldn't maybe see it from the pages there, but for the schools collection, what they do with the material is that they detail who was the interviewee, they are named, and the interviewer. So in many cases, the interviewer will be maybe still alive, or it's somebody's mother or father. So the general public are going in as an exercise in connecting with their pasts in a real way and a nostalgic way. So that's a very effective exercise for them, which brings them into this whole area of what we might call heritage, right? So they love that. You know, you go, oh, look, that's my mother or my grandfather. Look, that's what they said. You know, they were children going to school. Huh? So it's a very emotional connection. No, so that's that one nice thing. And people are doing that all the time. You know, they're in and out of the collection all the time. And bringing that into different public fora and using it. But I suppose to me, just thinking about it is, the resource is incredible, and we're very lucky to have it. And it is kind of doing something of what Dúlairge set out to do, giving us an understanding of ourselves. But it's an understanding within an ideological context. And what comes through in the narratives is that how food is described is kind of fossilized, really. So there's no sense of dynamic about it. So it's like the contributors couldn't talk about what they were doing now in the 1930s. That didn't suit the ideology. So it was like this idea of trying to capture authenticity, but actually killing authenticity in the process. And that's very interesting for me now, because it does come back to the fact that what we look upon as being a jewel in Irish heritage is very much ideologically shaped. And we have to realise that, I suppose, as part of it. So then that brings us back to all of these discussions of identity and so on. So this is great because it gives us the idyll of Ireland, the idyll of an Irish identity, located, like Lucy Long talks about, located in a rural context associated with the vernacular. It's the essentialness of Irishness constructed. And they don't give value or room or space to leave the messy sides of us kind of come through. Ireland in modernity, if you want to be that dualistic and simplistic about it. You know? And that's really interesting, because what's happening in Ireland at the moment is that there seems to be a Gaelic revival part 2 happening at the moment, where the Irish language is almost like a fashionable accessory. Folklore amongst a younger generation is something that they all must have. But how do we perceive that, and how do we understand that, I suppose, if understanding is at all possible? And we need to, I suppose, not only put a light on the glorious past, if you like, but also the messiness of the past. We tend to not think about the messiness, because we want to talk about oatcakes and hardening stands and the real Ireland, the essence of what we are, or understanding, as Dúlairge kind of set it out, you know. You know, there's very little of an urban context in these collections, so what happens to all of those people? You know? They're kind of sidelined in many ways, because that's what wasn't the Ireland that wanted to be constructed at the time. So it's a really interesting one, you know. It's interesting in accessibility to heritage, but also how that accessibility is being received, and then coming out again in different expressions, I suppose. So it's really interesting one.
Andrea Borghini.
Do we have time for this?
We do.
Okay. Yeah. No, first of all, thank you. I'm just listening, I'm learning so much. These are amazing research that you are sharing. There will be several comments, but I'll make a boring, let's say, philosophical comment about this, and trying to relate to the project, you know, also to the goals of the project. So from a philosophical, let's say, perspective, like some of the issues are central theoretical issues related to the recipe and the representation of the recipe. And then you can start thinking of parallels, like what have we done I don't know, with music, for example, right? You have the music, and then you have the score, but you also can think architecture, or you can think dance, or, and there is a lot also related to the temporality, right? So the format that we choose for the representation of these practices, tools, instructions for doing something maybe, or whatever, also how Lisa put it, the quote you had. There are lots of different forms, right? And so one of the risks when we are going with the digital representations is that maybe we end up having very rigid formats based on the type of evidence that we are using, the archives that we're working with. And so this is, I think, is also for the project to insert as much as possible what could look like odd or unusual or weird recipes, but actually probably throughout the history of humanity they were very common, ways of sharing how to prepare something in a way that is pleasurable, safe, and nutritious, right? It's definitely what we want to have as a representation of a recipe, right? So I think a lot of examples that we have here, if they come from the past, they might tend to have more standardized formats in one direction or another, but probably emphasizing the odd situations and trying to find ways to highlight them in the tools that we develop is really key, because also here we're having discussions between maybe Canada, Ireland, Italy, and so on and so forth, but then if we go to other parts of the globe, we have lots of other ways of sharing precisely this information, right? And maybe very different formats. So if we go digital and then we create a very structured format, then we are excluding by default with no reason. So that's where we have an opportunity, but also it's a big risk, at least from a theoretical point of view. So I know this is not exactly a question, but it's just to say that there are questions for me that what you were raising are really these fundamental, with very nice examples, these fundamental tensions that we see. There is too much also in social media, the risk of going only one direction, right, with the format. And so trying to suggest also these other cases is really important. We should emphasize that. So just to say thank you for the examples.
I think that's a really interesting point about what happens when you structure the data and what you might miss. And I also, think about this quite a bit, that the recipe books that we're using for the 17th, 18th centuries, I mean, it's by accident that they survived. There's no reason that this was the typical thing. And in fact, there's traces of people talking about so-and-so showed me this recipe or told this recipe to me. And so there's clearly that sense of orality that your materials are really capturing, except because of the way early modern archives have developed, it's not visible anymore in the way that yours are actually visible and force these questions.
Yeah, and I suppose that's one of, I suppose, the kind of the fear is really of what we're doing is that what we do is suiting an official representation of a recipe, but what happens to all the oddities that surround that, like the oral narratives are outside officialdom, so they're not conforming to our approach to them, or structured approaches to them. And that's why I was trying to look at the recipes and get representative examples to build up a kind of a typology that was kind of leading towards, they were evolving into the conventional representation of the recipe. But then we exclude all of this wonderful worldviews and relationships with food, humans and their food. And they're all excluded now because they're outside, they're alternative. And how do we do that? How do we now fit that in? I'm not sure about, the forms being kind of so various across cultures, because when I sat down yesterday and I looked at Michelle's slides, I said, oh my God, this is just what they're doing in Ireland. And that's what they're doing as well in the early modern period. These are aid memoirs, really. Now, there might be sort of some characteristics or elements that are different, but in a generic sense, they are kind of fitting around the same kind of way of being in the recipe. Do you know, and how do you capture that? Like, how do you capture tacit, embodied information? How do you translate that into the spoken and printed word? You can't. That's why the interviewers were brilliant, you know. So maybe we should accept that a lot is going to be outside or missed. But then do we acknowledge that and say, look, we know that this is what we can't capture. Can we try and capture it? Because the formalised recipes are easy. Do you know, they're the easy ones. But it's the world outside them.
That's why for me there is a distinction between the recipe and the representation. And the recipe is what we do, and the representation is, it will always leave something outside. Besides it's a representation, we have to be aware of it.
Yeah, exactly.
I think too, it raises the question of where these things are taking place. So, for example, there's the representation that we could talk about, and you know that the one anecdote that Michelle was talking about, in which the man has all of these stories about where he's eaten in these memorable meals, and that's definitely representation. But on the other hand, sometimes recipe-like things pop up in weird places. So, for example, in a basically a travelogue / response to the British Navy, there was a British Navy captain in the South Seas. No, not the South Seas. He was in the Indian Ocean, and he had a lot of Indian sailors on his ship, and he gave this brilliant discussion about the curry they prepare, how the chef on the ship then turns this into food for the British sailors as well, so that he's making curry for them as well. And it's this delicious sounding curry, but there was enough there in terms of measurements and everything that I thought, oh, I could reconstruct this, and I did, and it was delicious. But it's in this place, and it's just a general conversation about food more generally, and why the British Navy should have more curry on board ships, because it's a great way to deal with, you know, scurvy and, you know, preserved growing vegetables. So there's part of a broader discussion, which is the representation. But there is, in the midst of it, what is basically a recipe. But again, you wouldn't think to go to that particular book and find a recipe. And I don't know that readers at the time would have done that either.
Yeah. Because I suppose it does come back to how we understand a recipe, Andrea, you know? And are we going to try and loosen that up somewhat, or not?
That people should use the term when they are giving it.
Yeah.
That's when I said the cross-culturality, because in some cases they might not say, I'm giving you the recipe.
No.
They might just talk it, and then, so it's a process. And then we single out that process, saying, oh, that's probably a recipe.
Rosie Song?
So thank you so much. This was so rich in discussion and presentation. And just picking up on Andrea's sort of focus on this project as well, and kind of bring it back to what we thought that we were trying to do. I think that one of the biggest challenges was precisely to try to capture all of these aspects. There is this data, there is the digital, there is, and I'll make a side note about Lisa, because our project is going to be read by Ref 2029 as well, right? And for Daniel and me, we're in a very weird situation in which we're in the School of Modern Languages and Cultures, and that they have no interest in what we do. So this is like the first multi-million funding that the area of humanities have received in the history of the University of Durham, and we got zero recognition. So this is not going to it's not even on the radar to become an impact case for our school. Then I don't know if you know this, right? But I take your point in which what then a panel of 6 people will read from all universities in the UK, in our area, what we do or we don't do, and they think what our website should look like. And it's really, it's frustrating, and it's really impossible to engage with that kind of thinking and how resources and research support will come out of this evaluation. So it's appalling. But so going back, so that's a side story. So and then on the part of Relish, for example, when we started this conversation, and because of the grant structure, we had to come up with an output. We had to produce or imagine a thing. And we had a really difficult time imagining what that thing would be because of all these complexities. And we couldn't think about one thing that would do all of those things, like the data, the otherness, the representation, what's outside and stuff. So we started with a very kind of generous definition, right? So that's why we work with philosophers of food that kind of give us an ontology. But then the outcome of it is just instances. So then our computer science, engineering people are saying, well, then let's do pockets, basically, right? So we will have kind of a public-facing thing, and we're trying to see what will users want. They're not going to come to our data platform for recipes, but maybe they'll come to connect with their ancestry, or to learn about the Irish case, or the Arabic connection, or the migrant Italian mobilities. And then, okay, but we want the researchers to think in more wider terms, so can we provide another pocket where researchers can find what they're looking for? So I guess in a sense, we're trying to kind of define something, but it's also incredibly complex. So I don't know if part of this exercise is precisely to tease out those complexities in ways that we are, in a way, creating a buffet instead of, like a prescribed kind of meal, right? So I guess it's more of a common question and just a sharing moment as we close this panel. But we are trying to sort of zero in a concept, but every evidence and every conversation that we have is pointing us to somewhere else. So this opportunity of thinking about that, I think, is a great exercise to make what we're interested in relevant in other aspects as well. So, I mean, thank you so much, everyone, to sharing your research, and we're just, I guess, developing this conversation. But I would love to hear from Lisa, like, you having engaged in this process, and you're kind of ending while we're kind of starting. Like, if you redid some of your projects again, how would you do it if it was like pie in the sky, no resource kind of limitations? Thank you.
30 seconds, please.
That's a great question. I don't know. I mean, there's a lot I'd do differently, and probably I would go more low tech from the beginning in a lot of ways, and not try to do everything. And so I think that gets back to what you were saying, that you keep going off in different directions, but you've got to nail down on which one, and just pick one and go with it. And don't overcomplicate it. Don't overegg the pudding, to use a culinary one.